Hello and welcome to CodeSlicing. In this series, we're going to be building an aperture, like a camera aperture. We're going to make it look really pretty, but we're going to do it using layout guides. So it's a way for me to showcase what we can really do with layout guides with relatively little effort. We're going to be transforming them, we're going to be animating them. You won't believe it. You might believe it. Well, I mean, if you've seen my episodes so far on layout guides, you will probably believe it. But if you haven't seen my series on layout guides so far, then it would be worth checking them out, because I wouldn't want you to get lost. And I'm not going to describe absolutely everything that we're doing, although I will try to make it as clear as possible so everybody can follow along. We're going to be creating this aperture in 3 stages. We're going to be creating the blade. All right, so we're going to be designing that thing. Then we're going to be using that blade to build our aperture and animate it. And then we're going to be putting some styling on it using custom modifiers. All right, it's going to look terrific. So join me for the ride and let's get started designing that blade. Right, so we're going to build this aperture and we're going to build it blade by blade. And I'm going to define a blade config for this of a type of grid, which is private let blade layout config is a layout guide config of type grid with 10 columns and 10 rows. Let's define our shape. So we'll make it a private shape of aperture blade. And because I'm going to overlay these blades, I'm going to put this all in a Z stack. And then we're going to loop through the number of blades. But for this one, we're only doing 1. So I'm going to just have this 1 blade here. Aperture blade. We'll give it a very simple styling. We're just going to say it's stroke of color black, line width of 2. We'll get rid of that spacer and we'll put the frame around the Z stack of 150. On top of that, we're going to put our layout guide, so we know what we're doing, which is the blade layout config. And we're going to say show layout guides is true. Now I'm actually going to pull in a debug parameter into this, because once we've got styling, animating, transforming, and all of that stuff going on, it would be nice if we could revert back to constructing our shape if we need to change the shape of the blade. So I'm going to add a parameter to this view at the top here. I'm just going to call it debug. We're going to put an initializer in with a default value of false for that. All right. And then down here, we can say that debug is true. And then instead of true, we can say that show layout guides is actually equal to debug. All right, so whenever we want, we can debug this and we can fix up our shape. Now at this point, we should be able to see our grid. Okay, good. And now we can start constructing our blade. Okay, very easy. Now, as you remember, when constructing one of these things using layout guides, the first thing we do is lay out our layout guide. So RG equals blade layout config laid out in the rectangle. Lovely. We want to move to the top. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a curved line from the top down to somewhere on the right-hand edge, and then we're going to curve it back up to the top and then join to the initial point. So we get kind of a hook shape. Now, as I showed in the Bezier curves episode of layout guides, and if you haven't seen it, do check it out. When you're dealing with curves, it's actually quite easy to define both control points as the start and end point when you are constructing it to begin with, and then sort out the rest of it later. So let's put the first curve in, all right, which is going to go from the top, which is where we are, and we're going to go to 10,8. Control point 1 is going to be the top where it came from. Control point 2 is going to be 10,8, where we're going. And we're going to have the control points on those points. And we want to be able to see them. And this is where we can adopt that debug parameter. All right, so we can say, let debug, which is a Boolean. And I'm going to put an initializer in as well. Okay, now we can pull that in, and I can say that debug is going to be used for show control points. And since we are debugging, this should show us our control points, but it won't until we actually pass them in. So debug is debug. All right, and there are our control points. Now we can start to move them around a bit. Now, it actually turns out that a good place for control point 1 is 5,4. That's what gives me a nice shape to the top. So we put that in, and you can see it pulls the top of it down. And then the control point 2 is 6,7. 6,7. And that was really just a case of trial and error to, move these control points around and see what gave me the kind of curve that I wanted. Now we move on to the second point, which we're going to go up to here, okay? All right, let's add it. So G, we're going to go to 2,0 at the top there. CP1 is going to be 10,8. And CP2 is going to be 2,0, which is where we ended up. Show control points is debug. And there we can see our curve. And after a bit of playing around, I determined that the best place for the first one is 5,8. And the best place for the second one was 1,5. And now we're going to just join up at the top there. Line to G.top. Okay, that gives us our hook. And the next thing we want to do is to style this thing. And that requires us to do two things. We've got to fill it and we've got to give it a shadow. And there is a catch with the shadow, as I will talk you through in just a second. So I'm going to put this in an extension on shape, like so. Private extension on shape. We'll call it blade style. Let's move that down a bit so we can see what we're doing. We'll pass in a debug parameter because we know we're going to use it. That returns some view. And if we're debugging, I just want to return what we've already done, which is this stroke here. I can take that and then just say self, like that. Else we're going to do our special styling. So for the minute, let's just put in the same styling for both. And then, so we can just treat it all like a view builder and not have to worry about different return types or anything like that. Let's just annotate this with view builder. And then up here, we can just say blade style with a debug of debug. And now we can start building out our styling. So instead of self stroke, we're going to do fill. All right, we're going to do a fill on this thing. I'm going to pass in my favorite linear gradient, which looks like this, red, yellow. And we'll send it to the bottom trailing. And now for this, let's actually turn debug off so we can see it. False. And resume. Next thing we want to do is put an overlay of a stroke on it. Okay, let's put an overlay of self stroke. We'll put a certain style on it with a line width of 1 and a line join, crucially, of round. We want it to look nice. Now we're going to put a shadow on it. And this is the catch I was talking to you about earlier. Now, shadows get a bit funny. In fact, I can show you here. If I just stick a shadow on this, right, then you can see that that is not the shadow I'm after, okay? When you start talking about custom shapes, Xcode 11 is not happy. Xcode 12 fixes this very nicely. But since we are in Xcode 11 for now, I'm going to create my own background for this custom shape, which looks something like this. Background, we do the trick where we know we are a shape. So we say self fill color dot black, and then we just blur that by 2.5, which should give us a realistic looking shadow. And it does. Now, you might be wondering why I'm using self all over the place when I could just call the functions directly because I'm part of that shape. In a relatively complicated extension like this, when you're applying stylings all over the place, I think it makes things clearer when you're using self so it doesn't merge into one and you can really pick out the points in the code where you're using the shape. You know, that's personal preference and that's what works for me. So if we want to go back to debugging this thing, we just say true in here. And we've got back to our lovely control point ridden shape that we can play around with and change to our heart's desires. But for now, we'll leave it on false. Okay, so that's a good place to stop for episode 1. And in the next episode, we're going to be using the blade that we've just designed to create the aperture itself by layering them on top of each other in a rotating spiral type thing. So join me for that. It's going to be brilliant. If you like this episode, give it a like, because it really helps people find the channel, and I appreciate the support. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing that, because you would not want to miss the next episode, I can assure you. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.